History tells us that America was built by brave men and bold ideas. But what if I told you one single decision, made in total secrecy, almost changed the destiny of the United States forever, and hardly anyone talks about it today? In the final years of the 19th century, America stood at a crossroads, though few recognized it at the time. The nation appeared confident on the surface. Factories roared with new machines, railroads stitched distant lands together, and cities climbed toward the sky with steel and ambition. Immigrants poured in from Europe, carrying hope in their pockets and hunger in their eyes. To the world, the United States looked unstoppable. But beneath that confidence lay fear. Fear of collapse, fear of rebellion, fear that the American experiment itself was far more fragile than anyone dared to admit. In Washington, D.C., gas lamps flickered along wide avenues as politicians walked briskly through marble corridors, whispering about things they would never say aloud. Newspapers spoke of prosperity, yet bread lines quietly lengthened. Wall Street celebrated expansion, while farmers in the Midwest watched their land drown in debt. The nation was growing, but unevenly, and the imbalance was beginning to crack its foundation. At the center of this tension stood money. Not just currency, but power. Gold-backed dollars favored banks and industrialists. Farmers and laborers demanded silver-backed money to ease crushing debts. This debate, known publicly as a technical disagreement over monetary policy, was in truth a battle over who America belonged to. The speeches were loud, but the real decisions were being shaped elsewhere, in private rooms among men whose names would later be etched into history books for very different reasons. One of those men was Senator Nelson W. Aldrich. Tall, composed, and calculated, Aldrich represented Rhode Island, but wielded influence far beyond his state. He understood finance better than most politicians, and politics better than most financiers. To the public, he spoke calmly about stability and progress. Privately, he warned that America was sitting on a ticking bomb. Financial panics had already rocked the country before, 1873, 1893, and each time the system barely survived. Banks collapsed overnight. Ordinary citizens lost everything. Riots flared. The government scrambled, reactive and disorganized. Aldrich believed the next panic would be worse. And he was right. By the early 1900s, American banks operated independently, with no central authority to coordinate responses to crises. When fear struck, people rushed to withdraw their money, triggering chain reactions that destroyed entire regions' economies. Europe watched with concern and opportunity. A weakened America meant stronger empires abroad. Behind closed doors, a quiet consensus began to form among powerful men. Something drastic had to be done, but what they planned could never survive public scrutiny. In November of 1910, as winter crept across the Atlantic coast, a small group of men boarded a private railroad car in Hoboken, New Jersey. There were no reporters, no official announcements. The men traveled under false names, pretending to be on a duck hunting trip. Even the train staff had been instructed not to ask questions. Their destination was Jekyll Island, a secluded retreat off the coast of Georgia, owned by some of the wealthiest families in America. Among them were representatives of the nation's largest banks, financiers connected to Wall Street dynasties, and political figures trusted to keep secrets. Together, they controlled a staggering portion of America's wealth, and they were about to decide something that would alter the country forever. But the American people would not be invited. At that time, most citizens believed deeply in the idea of democratic control. The revolution was still a living memory in textbooks and family stories. The notion that a small elite could dictate the nation's financial destiny contradicted everything Americans were taught to believe about their republic. That was precisely why secrecy was essential. On Jekyll Island, inside a guarded clubhouse surrounded by marshes and silence, the men met for days. They argued, calculated, revised, and argued again. They spoke not of elections or voters, but of liquidity, reserves, control mechanisms, and emergency powers. Their language was technical, but the implications were enormous. They were designing a new financial system, one that could stabilize the economy or dominate it. Back in the cities, ordinary Americans carried on with their lives, unaware that the rules governing their money, savings, and future were being rewritten without their consent. Factory workers punched clocks, farmers negotiated loans, families saved coins in jars, trusting that the system, flawed as it was, belonged to them. They did not know that the balance of power was shifting away from public institutions and toward a centralized authority that had never existed before in the United States. And yet, this decision did not emerge from pure greed or malice alone. Some of the men involved genuinely believed they were saving America. They feared that without decisive action, the country would descend into chaos, bank failures, mass unemployment, even revolution. Europe had seen such uprisings. Russia would soon explode into one. America, they believed, was not immune. The question was not whether to act, it was whether the American people could be trusted with the truth. As months passed, the plan slowly moved through Congress, carefully disguised, softened by language few citizens understood. Newspapers, often owned or influenced by financial interests, treated the subject as dull and technical. On December 23, 1913, just before Christmas, with much of the nation distracted, the decision became law. The United States had entered a new era. Few realized it at the time, but this single moment quietly transferred enormous financial power into a system largely insulated from direct democratic control. Supporters praised stability. Critics warned of danger. Most Americans noticed nothing at all, until years later, when consequences began to surface in ways no one could ignore. This was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning, because the decision made in secrecy would ripple through wars, depressions, booms, and busts. It would shape who prospered and who suffered. It would determine how crises were handled and who paid the price. And more than a century later, Americans would still be living with the echoes of that quiet winter meeting on a quiet island where the future of a nation was decided without its people. The men who gathered on Jekyll Island understood one thing with absolute clarity. History would never forgive them if their names were openly attached to what they were about to create. That understanding shaped every word spoken inside the clubhouse, every note taken, and every decision made in whispers rather than declarations. They agreed on one rule before the first serious discussion began. Nothing that happened on the island would ever be acknowledged publicly. The island itself was chosen for a reason. Jekyll Island was not merely remote, it was exclusive, accessible only by invitation, owned by America's richest families, and guarded by staff loyal to wealth and discretion. Here, industrial titans had escaped public life for years, hunting, dining, and strategizing far from the eyes of ordinary citizens. No journalist wandered these grounds by accident. Inside the heavy wooden walls of the club, the atmosphere was tense but focused. These men were not united by friendship. Some had been rivals for decades. Others distrusted one another deeply. But all of them feared instability more than they feared each other. America's financial system, as it stood, was a patchwork of private banks, each guarding its own reserves. When panic struck, there was no central force to stop the bleeding. The strongest banks survived by absorbing the weak. The public paid the price. One banker spoke bluntly. If another major panic occurred, he said, people would stop trusting banks altogether.
The next step would not be reform, it would be revolt. Another man warned of something worse. If America collapsed financially, European powers would fill the vacuum. London already dominated global finance. Without reform, the United States would remain vulnerable, dependent, and ultimately subordinate. The discussion turned toward solutions. Some argued for a fully government-controlled central bank. Others rejected that idea immediately, convinced that politicians were too short-sighted, too emotional, too susceptible to public pressure. Elections, they said, were incompatible with financial stability. The compromise they crafted was delicate and deliberate. A system that would appear public but operate independently. A structure that would answer to Congress on paper but remain insulated in practice. A design complex enough that the average citizen would never fully understand it. They debated names, knowing that language mattered. Central bank sounded dangerous, foreign, and authoritarian. Americans distrusted anything that resembled European institutions, so they avoided it. Instead, they chose words that suggested balance, neutrality, and decentralization, words that implied safety rather than control. By the time the meetings ended, they had drafted the skeleton of a new institution, one that could issue currency, regulate credit, act in emergencies, and quietly reshape the economy during moments of crisis. When the men left Jekyll Island, they did so separately, under the same false names they had used to arrive. No photographs were taken, no official minutes recorded. Each man carried pieces of the plan in his memory, sworn to silence. Back in Washington, the next phase began, selling the idea without revealing its origin. The legislation was introduced slowly, framed as a technical adjustment rather than a revolutionary change. Supporters emphasized stability, protection from panic, and economic growth. Opponents warned of centralized power, corruption, and betrayal of democratic principles. But the opposition struggled to explain the danger. The proposal was dense, written in language few understood. Complex mechanisms replaced simple truths. Even educated readers found themselves lost in terminology. That confusion was not accidental. While public debate unfolded on the surface, private influence worked beneath it. Bankers met with legislators, promises were made, campaigns were quietly supported. Newspapers minimized criticism or framed dissenters as alarmists, clinging to outdated ideas. The timing was perfect. As Christmas approached in 1913, Washington emptied. Representatives left to be with their families. Attention drifted away from politics and toward celebration. On December 23rd, with little fanfare, the bill passed. There were no fireworks, no crowds gathered in the streets. America went to sleep that night, largely unaware that its financial system had been fundamentally transformed. At first, nothing seemed different. Banks still operated, money still circulated, life continued as before. Supporters praised the reform as responsible governance. Critics warned that the consequences would not appear immediately, but history, they said, always revealed the truth eventually. They were right. Within a few years, the world would be plunged into a war unlike anything humanity had seen. The new system would be tested under pressures no one had fully anticipated. Money would be created at unprecedented scales. Debt would grow. Power would concentrate. And when disaster struck again, far greater than any previous panic, Americans would begin asking questions they should have asked much earlier. Who really controlled the nation's money? Who benefited when crises occurred? And why did ordinary citizens always seem to pay the highest price? Those questions would not be answered quickly. Some who tried to raise them would be ridiculed, others silenced politically. A few would disappear from public life altogether. But the consequences of that quiet winter decision would echo through the Great Depression, shape the outcome of global wars, and redefine the meaning of economic freedom in America.
For nearly a decade after the quiet passage of the new financial system, America appeared to thrive. The war in Europe had transformed the United States into an industrial powerhouse. Factories ran day and night. Banks extended credit freely. Stock prices climbed with a confidence that felt unstoppable. To many Americans, this was proof that the system worked. Money flowed more easily than ever before. Loans were abundant. New businesses emerged overnight. Newspapers celebrated a new era of prosperity, one powered by modern finance and scientific management of the economy. The idea that the nation could ever again face a devastating collapse began to feel outdated, almost naive. But beneath the celebration, something dangerous was growing. The new system had made it easier to expand credit, but not easier to control human behavior. Speculation replaced caution. Borrowed money fueled stock purchases. Banks lent not just to businesses that produced real goods, but to investors chasing paper profits. Ordinary Americans were drawn in. Factory workers invested their savings. Clerks bought stocks on margin. Farmers, still struggling with debt from earlier years, were promised that the market would finally lift them into security. The idea that prices could only rise became common wisdom. Inside financial circles, a few men saw the warning signs. They noticed the growing gap between real economic productivity and market valuations. They understood that credit expansion, if left unchecked, created bubbles that eventually collapsed. Some quietly urged restraint, but restraint was unpopular. Political leaders feared slowing growth, bankers feared losing profits, and the new financial authority, designed to act independently, hesitated to intervene too forcefully. Stability, they believed, meant avoiding panic at all costs, so they waited. In October 1929, the illusion shattered. The market began to fall, slowly at first, then violently. Prices collapsed in waves, fortunes vanished in days. Margin calls triggered forced selling, which drove prices down further. Fear spread faster than facts ever could. For the first time, Americans experienced a modern financial catastrophe on a national scale. Banks began to fail. Despite the existence of the new system, confidence evaporated. People lined up outside bank doors, desperate to withdraw their savings before it was too late. Some banks survived, many did not. The authority that had been created to prevent exactly this scenario now faced its greatest test, and it faltered. Intervention was hesitant, fragmented, and often too late. Credit tightened instead of expanding, liquidity dried up, businesses closed, unemployment surged. By 1933, nearly 1 in 4 American workers was without a job. Families lost homes. Farmers lost land that had been in their families for generations. Children went hungry. Men who had once believed in endless progress stood in soup lines, ashamed and silent. And everywhere the same question echoed: how could this happen again? Critics of the system grew louder. They argued that the concentration of financial power had made the collapse worse, not better. Decisions made by a small group of unelected officials now affected millions of lives, and those officials were largely insulated from the consequences. Some pointed back to Jekyll Island, to the secrecy, to the warnings that had been dismissed as paranoia. They argued that the system was never designed to protect ordinary Americans, but to protect banks. The defenders pushed back. They claimed the collapse would have been worse without intervention. They insisted the problem was human greed, not institutional design. They argued that the solution was not less central control, but more. Out of the chaos emerged a new political force. Franklin D. Roosevelt entered the White House with a promise to restore trust. He spoke directly to the people, acknowledging their fear and anger. He closed the banks temporarily, restructured the system, and expanded the role of government in unprecedented ways. For many Americans, these actions felt like salvation, but they also marked a turning point. The balance between government, finance, and individual freedom shifted again. Emergency powers became permanent tools. Debt expanded dramatically. The idea that the federal government and its financial machinery could manage economic life took root. The nation survived, but it was changed. Behind the scenes, the system's architects watched closely. Some felt vindicated, others quietly admitted mistakes. A few expressed regret, though never publicly. What most Americans did not realize was that the lessons of the Great Depression would not be applied equally. The system learned how to protect itself. It did not always learn how to protect the people. As decades passed, memory faded. The pain of the 1930s became history lessons rather than lived experience. Confidence slowly returned, and with it, a dangerous belief that the system had finally been mastered. It had not, because the same forces, credit expansion, speculation, secrecy, and concentrated power, were still at work, evolving quietly beneath the surface. And when the next great test arrived, it would not look like the past. It would look modern, sophisticated, unavoidable. When the Second World War ended, the United States emerged not merely victorious, but transformed. Europe lay in ruins. Empires that had ruled for centuries were exhausted or broken, and standing above the wreckage was America, industrially intact, financially powerful, and suddenly responsible for shaping a new global order. This was the moment the system's architects had quietly prepared for. Money was no longer just a domestic tool, it was now a weapon of influence. At an international conference held in 1944, in a quiet town called Bretton Woods, representatives from dozens of nations gathered to design the post-war financial world. The United States dominated the discussion. Its currency became the anchor of global trade. Other nations tied their economies to the dollar, and the dollar was tied to gold, at least in theory. On the surface, this arrangement promised stability. In reality, it gave unprecedented leverage to the American financial system. For the first time in history, one nation's monetary decisions could ripple instantly across the globe. Loans, aid packages, reconstruction funds all flowed through institutions shaped by the same philosophy born decades earlier in secrecy. The Cold War intensified this power. Fear replaced openness. National security justified silence. Economic policy became classified strategy. Decisions that affected millions were now framed as necessities in a global struggle between ideologies. At home, Americans enjoyed prosperity. Suburbs expanded, consumer credit became normal, cars, appliances, and homes were purchased not with savings, but with debt. The system encouraged it. Growth depended on it. Few questioned the long-term cost. Behind the scenes, however, cracks were forming. Gold reserves quietly drained as foreign nations accumulated dollars and demanded conversions. The promise that every dollar could be backed by gold became harder to keep. The math no longer worked. In 1971, another decision was made, this time openly, but explained vaguely. The United States abandoned the gold standard. With a single announcement, money became something entirely new. No longer anchored to a physical limit, it could now be created by policy, by decision, by necessity. Supporters called it flexibility. Critics called it a betrayal. What followed was an era of inflation, uncertainty, and financial experimentation. Markets grew more complex. Derivatives, leverage, and abstract instruments replaced tangible assets. Wealth concentrated at the top. Debt became permanent. And once again, ordinary Americans were told not to worry. Trust the experts, trust the institutions, trust the system. But trust was wearing thin. By the late 20th century, deregulation accelerated. Financial institutions grew larger, more interconnected, and more fragile. Risk was hidden behind algorithms and legal language few understood. Profits soared. Warnings were ignored. Then came 2008. The collapse unfolded faster than anyone admitted was possible. Housing markets imploded, banks teetered on the edge of failure, credit froze, jobs vanished. And once again, the system faced a choice. This time, it acted decisively. Trillions of dollars were created almost overnight. Financial institutions were rescued, markets stabilized. The catastrophe was contained. But the cost was clear. Those who caused the crisis survived, many prospered. Those who did not lost homes, savings, and futures. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Each crisis strengthened the system's power while eroding public trust. Each rescue expanded authority without expanding accountability. Each generation was told the same story, that the alternative would be worse. Some Americans began to question not just policies, but origins. They traced the line backward, from bailouts to deregulation, from deregulation to post-war dominance, from post-war dominance to a winter meeting on a quiet island where secrecy had been chosen over transparency. The realization was unsettling. The system had never truly belonged to the people. It had been designed to manage them. Yet even now, the story was incomplete, because there were those inside the system who had tried to warn the public. Economists who challenged official narratives, politicians who questioned concentrated power, analysts who predicted collapse long before it arrived. Their stories rarely made headlines. Some were dismissed as radicals, others were sidelined. A few were quietly removed from positions of influence, not through violence, but through isolation. Silence in modern America was far more effective than force. As the 21st century advanced, technology accelerated everything. Markets reacted in milliseconds. Decisions made by a handful of people could erase billions in seconds, and the distance between cause and effect grew harder to see. But the consequences remained real. Wages stagnated, debt increased, inequality widened, and trust, once the foundation of the American experiment, continued to erode. The forgotten decision had done more than reshape finance. It had reshaped the relationship between the citizen and the state. The question lingered in the American conscience like an unresolved echo. Would the nation continue living with choices made long ago, or finally demand a different path? For most of the 20th century, the distance between decision-makers and ordinary citizens had grown quietly but steadily. What began as a temporary solution to financial instability had evolved into a permanent structure of power. Generations were born into it, educated within it, and taught to accept it as natural. The origins faded into footnotes. The secrecy became normal. And yet, history has a way of resurfacing when pressure builds. In the years following the financial crisis of 2008, something changed in the public mood. Anger no longer dissipated as quickly. Questions lingered longer. People who had once trusted institutions without hesitation began to scrutinize them with suspicion. Why, they asked, did crises always seem to transfer wealth upward? Why were losses socialized while gains remained private? Why did the language of too big to fail never apply to families, workers, or communities? These questions were not new, but this time they spread faster. Technology broke the monopoly of information. Archived documents surfaced. Declassified records were shared widely. Independent researchers connected dots that had once been isolated. The story of Jekyll Island, once dismissed as conspiracy, was re-examined through primary sources and first-hand accounts. And for the first time, many Americans confronted a deeply uncomfortable truth. The system had not drifted away from democracy by accident. It had been designed that way, carefully, intentionally, and gradually. This realization did not lead to immediate revolution. Americans were not a people prone to sudden collapse, but it did lead to something more dangerous to entrenched power: sustained skepticism. Movements emerged across the political spectrum. Some demanded transparency, others demanded reform, a few demanded complete dismantling. They disagreed on solutions, but they agreed on one thing: the status quo was no longer acceptable. Inside institutions, quiet debates intensified. Younger economists questioned models their predecessors treated as sacred. Policymakers worried not only about markets, but legitimacy. Even within the system, some began to admit what had once been unthinkable, that stability without trust was an illusion. But power does not surrender easily. Reforms were proposed, diluted, delayed. Language softened radical ideas into manageable adjustments. Committees formed, reports were written. Time passed. And still, the underlying structure remained. The truth was difficult to face. The decision made long ago had succeeded precisely because it removed urgency from public participation. By making financial power abstract, technical, and distant, it discouraged engagement. People focused on surviving within the system rather than questioning its foundations. Yet history also shows something else. Every system built in secrecy eventually faces a reckoning, not necessarily through collapse, but through exposure. Once origins are understood, legitimacy must be earned anew. America had reached that moment. Not at the point of destruction, but at a crossroads. One path offered comfort through familiarity, continued reliance on institutions that promised stability while quietly consolidating power, a future where crises were managed, not prevented, and inequality was treated as inevitable. The other path was uncertain and difficult. It required public understanding, civic engagement, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about how the nation had really been governed. It demanded transparency over convenience, participation over passivity. This path offered no guarantees, but it offered something America had always claimed to value above all else: choice. The men who met on Jekyll Island believed secrecy was necessary to save the nation. Perhaps in their time, they were partly right, but they could not foresee a world where the temporary would become permanent, where emergency would become policy, and where silence would last for generations. The future now belongs to those who know the past, not the simplified version taught in classrooms, not the comforting myths repeated in speeches, but the complicated, unsettling reality of how power truly works. America's story has never been finished. It is rewritten by each generation, by what it accepts, what it tolerates, and what it finally decides to change. The question is no longer whether the forgotten decision shaped the nation. It did. The question now is whether Americans will continue to live with it or finally choose a different ending.
Epilogue: the story that didn't end. The story did not end with awareness. Awareness, history shows, is only the first tremor before real change or real suppression. As more Americans began questioning the foundations of their financial reality, resistance appeared in subtle forms. Not tanks in the streets, not bans or arrests. Instead, something far more familiar: distraction. News cycles accelerated, crises overlapped, culture wars replaced economic debate. Complex financial questions were reframed as partisan noise. Anyone who spoke too plainly about systemic power was labeled extreme, unrealistic, or dangerous. The system had adapted. It no longer relied on secrecy alone. It relied on exhaustion. People were busy surviving, working longer hours, carrying more debt, juggling uncertainty. Time to study monetary history or institutional design became a luxury, and so the system persisted, not because it was loved, but because it was difficult to confront. Yet beneath the surface, pressure continued to build. New generations entered adulthood already skeptical. They had lived through crises they did not cause. They had watched promises break repeatedly. Home ownership slipped out of reach. Education became debt. Healthcare became risk. Stability became conditional. They asked different questions than their parents. Not how do I succeed within the system, but why does the system require so many to fail? These questions echoed in universities, online forums, grassroots movements, and even within financial institutions themselves. Quietly, cautiously, insiders began to speak, sometimes anonymously, sometimes after retirement, sometimes only when they felt they had nothing left to lose. They described the system that no longer corrected itself, one that depended on constant intervention, one that rewarded risk when it succeeded and punished society when it failed, one that could not be allowed to collapse, not because it served everyone, but because too much depended on it. This was the paradox. The system was both powerful and fragile, too big to fail, too entrenched to reform easily, too complex to explain simply. History had seen this before. Empires often believed their structures eternal right up until the moment they weren't. Collapse rarely came from a single event. It came from accumulated imbalance, ignored warnings, and the gradual loss of legitimacy. America was not immune. The signs were there, not in dramatic headlines, but in quiet shifts: declining trust in institutions, rising alternative economic ideas, experiments with new forms of exchange, decentralization, and transparency. Some failed, some were absorbed, some scared those in power more than they admitted. Because for the first time in over a century, the idea of choice was returning. Not guaranteed success, not easy solutions, but the possibility of reimagining systems that had once been declared untouchable. And that possibility mattered. The men who gathered on Jekyll Island believed they were preventing chaos. They believed the public could not handle the truth. They believed control was safer than consent. What they could not predict was a future where information could not be contained indefinitely, where secrecy aged poorly, and where legitimacy required explanation, not authority. America now lives in that future. The outcome is not predetermined. History does not move in straight lines. It pauses, repeats, and sometimes corrects itself in unexpected ways. What comes next depends not on institutions alone, but on collective will, on whether understanding turns into participation and participation into accountability. The forgotten decision still shapes daily life, but forgotten does not mean permanent. Every system exists only as long as people believe it must, and belief, once questioned, is never quite the same again. The story continues not on an island, not in secret meetings, but in public consciousness, unfolding slowly, uncertainly, and still unfinished. Because the most powerful chapter in American history has never been written by elites alone. Afterward, when the quiet becomes loud. There is a moment in every long story when silence stops working. Not because people suddenly agree, but because too many no longer believe. That moment did not arrive with a single protest or election. It arrived gradually, through lived experience, through the feeling that no matter how hard one worked, the distance between effort and reward kept growing, through the realization that emergencies were no longer rare, they were routine, through the quiet understanding that something structural was wrong. For decades, Americans had been told that the system corrected itself, that downturns were natural, that patience was virtuous, that growth would eventually reach everyone. But patience has limits. As the years passed, emergency measures became standard policy. Interest rates hovered near zero for so long that an entire generation grew up believing money had no cost. Asset prices soared while wages stalled. Those who owned benefited. Those who didn't fell further behind. The divide was no longer theoretical. It was visible in neighborhoods, classrooms, and hospitals. And slowly, something shifted, not in markets, but in mindset. People stopped asking when things would go back to normal. They began asking whose normal it had ever been. This was dangerous territory for any system built on managed consent. Because once people stop expecting restoration, they start imagining alternatives. Some alternatives were naive, some were reckless, some were deeply thoughtful. But imagination itself was the threat. Inside institutions, this was felt long before it was acknowledged publicly. Confidence indicators could not measure legitimacy. Balance sheets could not capture trust. Yet policymakers sensed it in the tone of public discourse, in the resistance to official narratives, in the refusal to accept simple explanations for complex failures. The old tools worked less effectively. Assurances rang hollow. Expert consensus convinced fewer. Authority demanded justification. This was not collapse, it was erosion. And erosion is far harder to fight because it happens everywhere at once. Attempts were made to restore faith, transparency initiatives, public statements, educational campaigns, but they avoided the central issue, the origin of power itself. They explained outcomes without confronting design. And design was the uncomfortable truth. The system had been built to prioritize stability over participation, efficiency over consent. It assumed that if results were acceptable, process would be forgiven. That assumption held for a time. But history shows that legitimacy is not permanent. It must be renewed. The irony was profound. The very mechanisms created to protect the nation from instability had, over generations, produced a different kind of instability, one rooted not in markets, but in meaning. People no longer understood why things were the way they were, only that they felt excluded from decisions that shaped their lives. And exclusion breeds distance. Distance breeds resentment. Resentment eventually demands expression. What that expression will become is still unknown. History does not announce its turning points in advance. It only becomes clear in hindsight when patterns align and momentum shifts. The United States has reached such a moment before. Each time, the outcome depended not on inevitability, but on engagement, on whether reform was embraced early or forced late. The decision made long ago was born of fear of panic, fear of instability, fear of the public. The decision that lies ahead must be born of something else. Trust. Not blind trust, but informed trust. Participation. Not chaos, but shared responsibility. Transparency. Not perfection, but honesty. The story that began in secrecy can only end in openness. But whether it will, that remains unwritten. But one truth stands firm, cutting through a century of policy and power. A system may shape a nation for generations, but a nation, when it chooses to remember, can still reshape its system. And that choice, quiet or loud, gradual or sudden, belongs not to history, not to institutions, not to men in closed rooms. It belongs to the people who decide that understanding is no longer optional.
The story continues, not with a single moment of rupture, but with a series of realizations, small at first, almost imperceptible, then impossible to ignore. In living rooms across the country, conversations changed. Parents who once told their children to play by the rules now hesitated, unsure what those rules actually guaranteed. Teachers noticed students asking sharper questions, not just about history, but about purpose. Veterans returned home proud of service, yet uneasy about what exactly they had defended. Entrepreneurs built companies faster than ever, yet sensed that success now depended as much on proximity to power as on innovation. None of this made headlines, but history is rarely moved by headlines alone. It is moved by alignment, when private doubts become shared understanding. At first, institutions responded as they always had, by managing perception. Reports were issued explaining inequality as a temporary imbalance. New programs were announced with familiar language. Committees formed to study long-standing problems. Each response assumed that dissatisfaction was shallow, emotional, or uninformed. They misunderstood the moment. This time, the questions were structural. Why did money created in emergencies never seem to disappear afterward? Why did crises justify extraordinary powers, but recovery never reduced them? Why did accountability flow downward, while authority flowed upward? These questions did not require ideology, they required observation.
and observation had become widespread. Technology played an unexpected role, not because it radicalized everyone, but because it allowed patterns to be seen. Individuals who once felt isolated discovered that their experiences were shared by millions. Stories overlapped, timelines matched, explanations that once sounded convincing began to feel incomplete. A quiet literacy emerged, not technical mastery of finance, but intuitive understanding of power. People learned that complexity can be a shield, that neutrality can mask preference, that independence often means independence from public consequence. This understanding did not turn Americans against the idea of stability. They still valued order, predictability, and growth. What changed was their tolerance for exclusion. They wanted to be included in decisions that defined risk and reward. Not at once, not unanimously, but unmistakably. Inside the system, fractures appeared. Some officials clung to orthodoxy, convinced that legitimacy could be restored through reassurance alone. Others quietly pushed for reforms they would never have considered earlier: simplification, transparency, limits. A few resigned, unwilling to defend structures they no longer believed in. None of this happened on television. It happened in meetings that ended without consensus, in memos written cautiously, in careers quietly redirected. Power sensed pressure, and pressure changes behavior. Policies once dismissed as impossible were suddenly discussed, not implemented perhaps, but acknowledged. Language shifted. The public was no longer described as uninformed, but as concerned. Trust was no longer assumed, it was described as something to be rebuilt. That word mattered. Rebuilt implies damage. For over a century, the system had operated on the belief that its origins were irrelevant, that performance alone justified authority. But performance without consent is fragile. It survives only as long as people believe there is no alternative. That belief was weakening, not replaced by certainty, but by curiosity. History teaches that curiosity is the beginning of change. Because once people ask how things came to be, they begin to imagine how they might be different. And difference, even imagined, alters behavior. It changes expectations. It reshapes the boundaries of what is considered acceptable. The forgotten decision had been powerful because it was invisible. Now it was visible. Not to everyone, not completely, but enough. And visibility alters power. The story continues in courtrooms where arguments once considered fringe are now heard seriously. In classrooms where students learn not only what happened, but why it was hidden. In communities experimenting, carefully, imperfectly, with alternatives that emphasize participation over abstraction. Some of these efforts will fail. History demands that they do. But failure is not the opposite of progress. Silence is. The United States has always been defined less by its institutions than by its arguments. Messy, unresolved, often uncomfortable debates about who holds power and why. Those arguments never truly end. They only pause. The pause is over. What comes next will not be a single reform or a single reckoning. It will be uneven, contested, and incomplete. It will involve compromise and conflict. It will disappoint those who expect clarity and alarm those who fear change. That is how real history moves. The men who once believed secrecy was necessary underestimated one thing: memory. Not the official kind, preserved in archives, but the collective kind, rediscovered when people feel the weight of decisions they never agreed to. The story continues every time someone refuses to accept "that's just how it works" as a final answer. It continues in the tension between stability and participation, between expertise and consent, between fear and trust. and it will continue as long as Americans keep doing what they have always done at their most consequential moments, not blindly obeying, not recklessly destroying, but arguing their way, slowly and imperfectly, toward a future they are willing to claim as their own.
There were no banners declaring a new era, no single law that rewrote everything overnight. What emerged instead was something far more difficult for power to confront: a sustained, low-grade pressure that could not be dismissed, silenced, or easily redirected. It had no single leader, no single ideology, no single demand, and that made it dangerous. Because systems built on centralized authority understand how to negotiate with movements, but struggle against moods. This was a mood, a growing sense that the gap between explanation and experience had become too wide to ignore. People listened to official statements and compared them to their lives. When the two did not match, they did not immediately rebel, but they stopped believing, and belief, once withdrawn, does not return on command. Markets continued to rise and fall, but the emotional response changed. Booms no longer inspired confidence, busts no longer shocked. Each fluctuation felt expected, almost routine, reinforcing the sense that instability was not an accident, but a feature. This normalization of crisis altered behavior. Households became cautious even during expansion. Young adults delayed milestones, not out of apathy, but calculation. Trust in long-term promises, pensions, stability, fairness eroded quietly. The system noticed the data. Participation rates shifted, risk appetite changed, political engagement became volatile, intense, fragmented, and distrustful of traditional channels. Voters punished incumbents not for ideology, but for proximity to power. Inside financial institutions, a strange contradiction took hold. On paper, everything functioned. In practice, confidence was brittle. Executives spoke more often about communication strategies than outcomes. Public relations expanded faster than reform. The goal was no longer to be trusted, but to appear trustworthy enough. This distinction mattered because appearing trustworthy relies on control of narrative. Being trustworthy requires change, and change threatens hierarchy. Some leaders understood this. Quietly, they began to prepare, not for reform, but for resilience. Stress tests multiplied, emergency authorities were broadened, contingency plans were refined. The system, once again, prepared to protect itself. But protection had limits. Each safeguard confirmed what many already suspected, that extraordinary power was no longer exceptional. It was assumed, embedded, ready. And assumption invites scrutiny. Scholars revisited moments long treated as settled. Journalists followed money trails once considered too complex to explain. Artists, writers, and filmmakers translated abstract power into human stories: loss, precarity, anger, resilience. Culture became a mirror, and the reflection was uncomfortable. The idea that no one is in control lost credibility. People could see decisions being made, interest rates adjusted, liquidity injected, markets stabilized. Control existed. The question was not whether, but for whom. This reframing was subtle but profound. It shifted debate from competence to consent, from do they know what they're doing to why do they get to decide. That question had been deferred for over a century. Now it was unavoidable. Not everyone welcomed it. Many feared that questioning foundations would invite chaos. They remembered history's darker chapters. They worried that dismantling systems would harm the most vulnerable. These fears were not imaginary. They were real. And they were used. Every proposal for transparency was framed as risk. Every call for participation was framed as instability. Every challenge to authority was equated with irresponsibility. This strategy had worked before, but it worked less well now, because people had lived through enough managed stability to know that safety without voice was not safety at all. It was dependence. Dependence breeds fear. Fear breeds silence. Silence preserves power. Breaking that cycle did not require violence. It required persistence. The story continues in that persistence, in the refusal to let questions fade, in the insistence that origins matter, and in the growing understanding that democracy is not a condition achieved once, but a practice that must be renewed continuously. The forgotten decision had assumed time would erase accountability. Instead, time had returned it, slowly, imperfectly, but unmistakably. The pressure had no name, but it had direction.
The pressure without a name began to take shape in ways that no law, regulation, or institution could fully contain. It was subtle at first. Citizens asking questions, communities forming around shared knowledge, young economists publishing analyses that challenged conventional wisdom. But gradually, the momentum became impossible to ignore. It was not loud. It did not come with banners, chants, or revolutions in the streets. Instead, it emerged in classrooms, in online forums, in local councils, in quiet conversations over dinner tables. Each question, each challenge, each refusal to accept "that's how it works" added weight, and weight accumulates faster than any central bank could account for. The remarkable thing about this awakening was its universality. It did not belong to a single party, ideology, or movement. People across cities and states, from all walks of life, began connecting patterns that had been hidden in plain sight. How money flowed, how power concentrated, how crises always seemed to spare the few and burden the many. It was a collective realization. The system that promised security often prioritized self-preservation over public welfare. And yet, it was not hopeless. People realized that power, no matter how entrenched, is conditional. Authority depends on consent, even if that consent is passive. Withdraw it, even partially, and the system must adapt or fail. For the first time in generations, Americans recognized the full meaning of what had been whispered through history. Secrecy can control, but knowledge liberates. Participation can stabilize, but apathy enables domination. Institutions, aware of the rising awareness, tried to respond. Press releases, public appearances, minor reforms, and transparency initiatives appeared designed to reassure. But the awakening was not about reassurance, it was about understanding. You cannot placate curiosity, you cannot silence scrutiny once it begins. The awakening was unstoppable because it was cumulative. One story of injustice, one overlooked crisis, one carefully traced line of decisions from a century ago reinforced the pattern. People began asking deliberately, who really decides? Who benefits? And why were we left out? The men on Jekyll Island could never have imagined this. They believed time would bury questions, that complexity would protect their choices, that ordinary Americans would never see the chain of events they set in motion. Yet here it was, unfolding slowly, irreversibly, not with fury, but with clarity. History had a way of reminding power that it is not eternal. Stability is temporary if it comes at the cost of inclusion. Control is fragile if legitimacy is ignored. Systems built to protect themselves cannot endure when the people begin to ask questions, connect patterns, and refuse passive obedience. The awakening continues. It grows in lectures, in essays, in grassroots organizing, in every citizen who refuses to accept the unseen as inevitable. It challenges authority not with chaos, but with awareness, not with destruction, but with scrutiny. And this awakening is just beginning, because the story that started with secrecy, fear, and control has never truly been about money or markets. It has always been about power. Power, in the end, belongs to those who know and those who act. The story continues, not in secret meetings or closed doors, but in the minds and choices of the people who refuse to be invisible in the system that shapes their lives. And for the first time in over a century, the question is no longer about survival. It is about participation. It is about democracy. It is about choice.